Hello, friends. My name is JJ, and I like countries. And if you clicked on this, you probably do too. And you probably also know what I mean when I say like countries. I don't just mean like visiting them, but rather thinking about them as like a set of things that can be remembered, studied, and organized in the same sort of way we do it with like planets or animals. Countries are important because so much of human civilization is organized around them. Countries go to war against each other when they disagree about something and form alliances when they don't. Global trade occurs at a country-to-country level, as does human movement. Whenever we want to figure out something important, like who is the world's best soccer player or who is the universe's most beautiful lady, we make countries compete. And this is a fairly new way of thinking about the world. These days, there are a ton of global organizations, from the World Bank to the International Judo Federation, but the vast majority of them were only created after 1945, which was the year World War II ended and the United Nations was formed. The UN, in turn, replaced the League of Nations, which was founded in 1920 in the aftermath of World War I. And these were the first two organizations in human history that made a serious effort to identify and bring together every country on Earth, but that also required coming up with a single universal standard of what is and isn't a country. For the last 100 years, the world has thus been able to enjoy the luxury of just being able to defer to either the UN or the League of Nations when it comes to defining what precisely is a country, a concept which everyone now understands to mean something along the lines of a self-governing geographic territory independent of all other countries. But I've always been very interested in just how confusing the world's country situation was before this definition went mainstream. Before the two world wars, after all, much of our planet was ruled by giant empires that were sort of like what we'd consider countries today, but sort of not. And they had all these little different things inside of them that were also sort of like countries, but also sort of not. For instance, well into the 20th century, a lot of people couldn't agree if my beloved Canada was a country. Canada was part of the British Empire, but it also had its own political rulers and borders. But you could say the same thing about the princely states of British India, or, for that matter, the various Indian tribes living in Canada itself. And certainly nobody considered those countries. So, in order to get a cleaner sense of what places people did consider countries before the wars, I decided to look at some educational books from the late 19th century. I would argue that that was the period in which humans first started to embrace this idea that all of the world's countries and nations could be identified and sorted in the same way that, like, leaves and bugs could be. The Victorian Age was a time in which this sort of systematizing of fact-based knowledge was very in vogue, which in turn saw a growth in demand for authoritative consumer goods like encyclopedias, atlases, and almanacs to be used by the growing ranks of the educated middle classes. A really cool website I use a lot when researching my videos is the David Rumsey Map Collection. It offers a really incredible database of high-resolution scans of maps and other informational books from the Victorian Age and before. And so, for this video, I browsed the archives for a collection of 19th century textbook pages that purported to show all of the countries of the world. Much to my delight, this information often came in the form of guides to all of the flags of all the countries of the world. Flags, of course, being another form of fact-based knowledge that was being heavily systematized at the time. In all, I came across 10 different charts purporting to show all of the nations of the world. They were published between the years 1850 and 1901, which I think makes for a pretty good survey of the time period I'm interested in. And having now analyzed this data, I feel like I have come up with a pretty clear sense of what educated Westerners in the late 19th century would have understood the category of all the countries of the world to include. So let us now go through my findings together. I think you will enjoy hearing about some of the weirder places that made it in, and be surprised at some of the places that didn't. But before we get into any of that, let us just hear a quick word from today's video sponsor, Sailing. Hello friends, so here I am at the Vancouver Yacht Club, where all of the rich big shots hang out. But you're no rich big shot, are you? No, you're always looking to save money. Well, let me talk to you about Sailing, which is a great way to save money while traveling. Normally, when you travel abroad, like say to Canada, you rack up enormous foreign roaming charges on your phone bill. You can try to get around that by either negotiating a foreign plan with your phone company or buying one of those little SIM cards. But did you know that there is an easier way that you can do on your phone right now? Saily is an app that takes advantage of a feature in your cell phone that many people don't even know exists, namely its ability to use eSIMs. Saily is an eSIMs app, so you just load it up, find a plan that's best suited to your needs in whatever part of the world you're visiting, purchase it, and then bammo, you can now instantly use your phone in a foreign land with complete peace of mind. If that sounds like something you might be into, allow me to sweeten the pot even more. You can get 15% off your next plan just by using promo code JJMCC in the checkout. Just search for Saily in the App Store or click the link in the description. eSIMs are shaking up the foreign travel experience, so don't get left behind. Give Saily a try today and see how much more affordable your next trip can be. Okay, so across these 10 charts, I would say that there are over 100 unique countries documented, with the maximum number of countries depicted on any one chart being around 75 on this Austrian chart from 1855, which purports to offer a visual representation of the countries of the world. But even 75 is, of course, a great deal fewer than the 193 countries that the UN recognizes today, which reflects how many countries today were formed by breaking off from larger ones. The fact that the numbers vary from chart to chart similarly shows just how much disagreement there was in the 19th century over what counted as a country and what didn't. Was an empire a single country, for instance? Or was it a collection of countries? It is an ambiguity that ominously foreshadows the bloody wars of nationalism that would attempt to answer this question in subsequent decades. But that said, even back in Victorian times, there were certainly some countries that everyone could agree on. The first group would be the 10 main European countries, all of which still exist today. They were all generally quite rich and powerful, and no one could deny their existence, and they were the UK, France, Spain, Portugal, Switzerland, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, Russia, and newcomer Greece, which had just recently gained its independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1829. Sweden and Norway were always there as well, but in Victorian times, they operated as a single fused country, referred to as Sweden and Norway. They only formally split in 1905, but I noticed that some charts began to list them individually even before that happened. A slightly less common, but still frequently seen European country is Poland, which was a more dubious inclusion. And this is because for the entirety of the 19th century, Poland existed as little more than a province of Russia, with the Russian emperor literally serving as king of Poland. But that said, the Polish people did have a distinct and well-known national identity just the same, and I assume that's why Poland still appears on most of these charts. After the main powers of Europe, there is another 13 countries whose existence was not really debatable by the mid-19th century, and thus appear on every list. And that is the 13 independent republics of the Americas. This group includes the USA, Mexico, and Haiti, and then the 10 countries of South America: Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, or as it was known until 1861, New Granada, Ecuador, Paraguay, Peru, Uruguay, and Venezuela. Central America was initially just one big country, known as the Republic of Central America. Between 1838 and 1841, the different states of this federation broke off to form 5 new nations: Guatemala, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Honduras. It seems that the bookmakers often forgot about them, however, so they only sometimes appear on lists, and often in an incomplete set. Sometimes people seem to be under the impression that the Central American Republic lasted for much longer than it did. The great powers of Asia, meanwhile, also appear on every list, which is to say China and Japan, as well as Persia and Siam, which were the old names of Iran and Thailand. Egypt usually appears too, although whether Egypt was an independent country during the 19th century is pretty debatable. Their kings during this period are often seen as British puppets, and the kingdom was officially part of the Ottoman Empire until 1922. Arabia is a similar situation. This was a label often slapped on the part of the world that we would now call Saudi Arabia. But in Victorian times, it wasn't yet a single unified country, but rather several different kingdoms that were nominally subordinate to the authority of the Ottomans. On that topic, I should note that the Ottoman Empire itself, a place that I think is pretty familiar to students of history today, does not appear on any of these charts. And that's because people in those days didn't really think of the Ottoman Empire as a country unto itself. The Ottomans were a royal family, and they ran an enormous multi-ethnic empire that covered much of the Middle East. They were part of an ethnic group known as Turks, and they were based in a part of the empire with a Turkish majority. People both inside and outside the empire, accordingly, referred to this area as Turkey. And this is the name that you tend to see on Victorian-era maps. When the empire collapsed after World War I, the Turkish part broke off and became the country of Turkey we have now. But before then, it was common to think of Turkey as the thing that was running the Ottoman Empire, which it pretty much was. You can see a similar thing with the Habsburg Empire, which was an equally big and diverse empire that ran much of Eastern Europe. Its rulers were Austrian, and Austria was the biggest nation within the empire. In 1804, the regime gave itself a German name that is hard to literally translate, Kaisertum Österreich, which means something like the emperorship of Austria, which gets at the idea of an empire under Austria, but not of Austria, if that makes sense. But in any case, outsiders usually just fixated on the Austrian part of the empire and ignored all of the other parts. In 1867, the Habsburg royal family declared themselves head of a new thing called the Monarchie Österreich-Ungarn, or Austria-Hungary monarchy. And after this is when you start to see English sources refer to Austria-Hungary as the new name of the empire. It was an empire that would, of course, famously collapse after World War I and produce a whole bunch of new countries, much like the Ottomans. Africa is mostly ignored on all of these lists, as it was being increasingly conquered by the European powers of the time, and there wasn't a lot of interest in documenting African national identities. The exception would be a handful of independent countries in northern Africa, which had a long history of both trading and feuding with the Europeans. These were often known as the Barbary states, and usually included Tunisia, Morocco, and Tripoli, which was a small kingdom in an area that is now part of Libya. Algeria, which is located here and was France's largest and proudest African colony, sometimes gets noted too, even though the French like to insist that it was inseparable from mainland France. Madagascar was an island kingdom off the coast of East Africa that was nominally independent, but increasingly transitioned into a French puppet state during the 19th century. It sometimes gets mentioned. Some of the later charts will note two small African countries known as the Orange Free State and the Transvaal. These were two rebel republics set up by the descendants of Dutch settlers in Britain's South African territories. They would eventually be reconquered by Britain during the so-called Boer Wars of the early 20th century, but during their brief existence, they were sometimes considered real countries in the West. Over in Asia, meanwhile, a forgotten nation that appears on almost every list is a place called Cochin, China. Quite the flag the Cochin Chinese had. This was a kingdom in Southeast Asia that became another French puppet state in the 19th century. Its capital was a large city known as Saigon, and in 1887 it was merged into a new French mega-colony known as French Indochina that would later evolve into Vietnam. Batavia is another common site. This was the old Dutch name for the city that is now Jakarta, the capital of the Dutch East Indies, which is now called Indonesia. The biggest, most obvious European colonies are often considered nations in these charts, But I noticed that sometimes they are just called whatever their biggest city or administrative capital was. A weird exception to this is India. It was a British colony that by the middle of the 19th century had over 200 million people, but none of the charts I looked at ever listed it as a nation. The best you get is an occasional cameo by the flag of the British East India Company. This might have been because the British really liked to push this idea that India was inseparable from the UK proper. The last of the increasingly powerless Indian emperors was deposed in 1858 with his title given to Queen Victoria, who then became Queen Empress of everything. All right, now in terms of weird 19th century countries that no longer exist at all, the one that really surprised me was the Ionian Islands, which appeared on almost every chart of countries I looked at. This is a group of islands off the coast of Greece that were considered very strategically important and have been repeatedly fought over for centuries. During the early 1800s, they were part of the British Empire and had some degree of self-government, but by 1864, Britain had ceded them to Greece, who have had them ever since. I honestly don't know enough about the history of this part of the world to say why this modest colonial possession was considered important enough to get equal billing with, say, Brazil. But the Ionian Islands even appear on this 1901 chart, long after they'd ceased to be even somewhat independent. Speaking of islands, how about the Sandwich Islands? This was a Polynesian kingdom in the North Pacific that you probably know better by its indigenous name, Hawaii. Hawaii was unified as a single country in 1795 and functioned as one for just over 100 years before being annexed to the US in 1898. A similar situation was the classy-sounding Society Islands, better known as Tahiti. Like Hawaii, these functioned as something resembling an independent kingdom under increasing foreign domination for several decades before being annexed by a major Western power at the end of the 19th century, in this case, France, in 1888. And then there is New Zealand. New Zealand is an interesting one because it routinely appears on these charts, while Britain's other white dominions, like Canada, Newfoundland, and Australia, don't. I think this was because there was a time in the 19th century where New Zealand was not, in fact, considered a white settler colony of the British Empire, but rather an independent island kingdom like Hawaii or Tahiti under the rule of its native Polynesian population. This was the flag used by the indigenous chiefs of New Zealand in the 1830s during a brief period where they were claiming unified sovereignty over the islands, only to surrender it to the British not long after. The impression I get is that some of the nuances of the New Zealand political situation probably weren't all that well known to the people making these charts in Europe or America. But by far, the majority of no longer existing 19th century countries on these charts fall into two categories: places that became part of Italy or places that became part of Germany. The mostly German-speaking principalities of Central Europe and the city-states of the Italian peninsula were outliers relative to the rest of Europe, in that they didn't organize themselves into a centralized kingdom or empire until relatively late in the 19th century, 1861 in the case of Italy, and 1871 in the case of Germany. This meant that attempting to make a list of all of the countries of the world prior to the late 1800s was a project always in danger of getting cluttered up with a bunch of little tiny Italian or German kingdoms, since Italy was ultimately formed as a merger of 7 different nations, while Germany was formed from a staggering 25. And thus, most of the lists I looked at usually only featured a handful of these places, usually the largest or most famous ones. In the Italian case, the most frequently mentioned predecessor nations tended to be Sardinia, Sicily, Tuscany, and the so-called Papal States, which were the territories that the Pope ruled. In the German case, meanwhile, the ones that always come up are Prussia, Bavaria, Hanover, Hamburg, Frankfurt, Baden, and Bremen. To this day, I think these are still some of the most iconic parts of Germany. What's particularly interesting, however, is that because these parts of Italy and Germany were so well known during the 19th century, and presumably so entrenched in the public imagination, they would sometimes continue to appear in lists of nations even after the mergers. Prussia, in particular, had been such a domineering presence in European politics in the early 1800s, it was kind of hard to accept that it was gone. So yeah, overall, I would say that these things offer a pretty fascinating glimpse into just how much our world has changed since the 19th century. Aside from Western Europe, the Americas, and a couple of countries in Asia, basically everyone alive today is living in a country that didn't exist 150 years ago, or at the very least was not fully independent yet. And that sort of gets to the darker political story that this little exercise exposes. The fact that it was so difficult in Victorian times to identify what was and wasn't a country wasn't just a product of textbook makers who didn't do their research. It was legitimately a very difficult thing to try to figure out. And it was from this confusing state of affairs that we saw the rise of nationalist movements in the 20th century, leading to a countless array of wars, including the two worst wars in human history, launched in large part to either uphold empires or create new countries that took orders from no one but themselves. Millions of people have died to create the post-1945 world order that we enjoy today, a world divided into 193 different independent nations that, at least in theory, recognize and respect each other as equals. Does it work perfectly? Obviously not. But like so many things in our modern world, it does seem like the best idea that anyone's come up with so far. What is your favorite weird Victorian-era country that doesn't exist anymore? Let me know in the comments, and I will see you next week.